Welcome to the Center for Lincoln Studies Illinois Rivals 1860 Presidential Campaign event. My name is Ann Mosley. I'm the acting director of the Center for Lincoln Studies, and I want to welcome all of you who are streaming in on our Facebook Live. And I wanted to let everyone know that this is our first event. So you are a part of our groundbreaking video release that we have here on Facebook. So I have a few housekeeping things I would like to say to you before we get started today. If you have a question at any time in the midst of this program, feel free to type in the chat your question. But also within the chat, feel free to let us know where you're streaming from. Are you here in Central Illinois? Are you here throughout the state, the nation, internationally? Let us know. Also, at the end of the program, we will be going through our Q&A, and we'll be able to ask some of your questions to our panelists and special musical guest. And at the end of the program as well, we will be picking from the questions that have been liked. So if you like a question or it's very similar to one that you want to ask, thumbs up, and it'll be moved up the list. All right. So you guys are in for a treat. We have some top-notch scholars with us today who work here at UIS. Our first panelist that we have is Dr. Michael Burlingame, who's the holder of the Chancellor Nomi B. Lynn Distinguished Chair in Lincoln Studies here at the University of Illinois, Springfield. He is the author of The Abraham Lincoln, A Life, The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln and the Civil War, as well as the editor of many collections of Lincoln primary source materials. He has written so much, it would take me probably the whole program to list all of his great works. I will say that he is a graduate from Princeton University and Johns Hopkins University. He taught at Connecticut College in New London for many years before joining the faculty here at UIS. So if you want, you can welcome Burlingame when he comes on board. Our other speaker tonight is Dr. Graham Peck, who specializes in antebellum American political history, and particularly in the life of Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. He also focuses on the origins of the Civil War, but he's also very interested in the intersection of scholarship and other forms of history. For this reason, he wrote, directed, and produced a feature-length film on Douglas for the use of the Douglas Tombs State Historic Site in Chicago, Illinois. The film features performances by leading Douglas and Lincoln reenactors, interviews with 5 historians of the Civil War, and hundreds of 19th century images, including photographs of rare archival documents from the University of Chicago's Special Collections Research Center, and the 8-episode podcast on the 19th century nun who founded what became the largest English-speaking female Catholic order in the world, the Sisters of Mercy. He is also an author of many articles and publications. And if you're interested in a listing of his works, just like Burlingame, I could spend the whole program talking about all of the major articles and books that he has written. So if you are interested in our 2 scholars and what they have published, feel free to contact us here at the Center for Lincoln Studies. Our special guest presenter today is Chris Valio. Chris, I'm sorry if I get your last name wrong, but Chris is an amazing folk singer as well as researcher in historic folk music. He brings to life the people and places of unmetropolitan America come to life throughout his songs and writings. He has spent the last 35 years plus in the rural Midwest, and he's been focusing on the roots music here in the Midwest as well. Performing on six-string and bottleneck slide guitars and vocals, Chris weaves original, contemporary, and traditional songs and narratives into compelling and entertaining portrait of the history and lifestyles of the Midwest. He has spent around 8 years serving as host and producer of the nationally distributed award-winning public radio performance series, Rural Route 3, where he performed next to and with a virtual who's who of contemporary and traditional folk musicians. He has twice served as the Illinois State Scholar for the Smithsonian Institution's traveling exhibit on roots music and new harmonies. So we have a trio of individuals who are going to showcase the historic rivalry between Lincoln and Douglas through historic research, documents, and through historic music. So I'm going to kick us off by having our two historians come on board with us, Dr. Michael Burlingame and Dr. Graham Peck. And I have a series of questions for us to discuss in regards to the Lincoln and Douglas rivalry at the beginning. So our first set of questions is setting the stage for the 1860 election. It's really important to know the 1850s and the difficulties and challenges that America faced during that time. What do you think were the main issues on Americans' minds in the 1850s when it came to the 1856 election and then leading up when they went to the polls again in 1860? What are the main events that we as an audience should know about leading up to the 1860 election?
Well, I would say it's the slavery expansion issue is the central issue. And if we're going to go back to the beginning of the 1850s, we should take a look at the 1850 Compromise, which was really hammered out by Stephen A. Douglas. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague.
Well, the 1850 Compromise was a resolution of a number of issues, but most notably the problem of territorial slavery. And the key compromise was called non-intervention with slavery by Congress in the territories taken from Mexico in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the non-intervention doctrine was that the Utah, New Mexico territories would not have a prohibition of slavery on them, as had been the case for a number of northern territories previously, such as the Northwestern territories. So in theory, settlers could go and either authorize slavery in the territories or they could forbid it. And this was kind of a middle ground between Southerners and Northerners, and this would prove to be Douglas's central doctrine for the remainder of the decade. And in fact, in 1854, Douglas continues this path of trying to find a route towards compromise over the expansion of slavery with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which he pushes through Congress, although in this case, not to diffuse tensions, but with the consequence of massively exacerbating national tensions over slavery, which he did not fully grasp the consequences of his decision. But nevertheless, he pushed for this act, which struck down the anti-slavery provisions of the 1820 Missouri Compromise, which had forbid slavery in territories many years past, and that northern settlers had expected to travel west and settle. And he replaced that prohibition with his doctrine of non-intervention by Congress with territorial slavery, what became known over the course of the 1850s as popular sovereignty, the idea that the people of a territory should decide the fate of slavery. So it was the power of the people. And so this was the doctrine that Douglas was shooting for, but it would produce an enormous response by Northerners angry with the striking down of territorial prohibition. It would lead to the Republican Party's rise. And with that, I'll turn it back to my colleague, Michael Burlingame.
Yes, and to us in the 21st century, it may seem strange that slavery extension was what everybody was so upset about. However, for many people in the North, the issue of slavery expansion was a proxy for slavery itself. And many people in the North who disliked slavery and would like to see it abolished felt that they could not favor abolition by the federal government, that if states wanted to abolish slavery, they could do that, that was cricket under the Constitution. But under the Constitution, the federal government had no power to abolish slavery where it had already taken root. But according to the Constitution, Congress has the power to make all rules and regulations for their territories. And so the Republicans said, well, if we attack slavery head on, at least we can attack it indirectly by saying slavery shall not be allowed to expand. And everybody who wants to see slavery abolished can at least rally around that because it is constitutional. And so the slavery extension issue became much more inflated in the public mind than we, in retrospect, might think it to be. But let's bear in mind that it really was a kind of substitute, a kind of proxy for the issue of slavery itself. If you didn't like slavery, if you thought it was immoral, if you thought it was wrong, then you supported the Republicans, even though their program did not call for the abolition of slavery, but it called for its containment. And also, the Republicans believed that if slavery was not allowed to expand, it would eventually wither and die. And if you surrounded the slave states with free states, that eventually slavery would die out because slaves would run away. The slaves that were adjacent to free states run away to the free states, that the slaveholders in those slave states would then withdraw their slaves further away from the boundaries with free states, that those slave states would then abolish slavery because there wouldn't be so many slaveholders, and eventually slavery would die out. So it wasn't wishful thinking on the part of the Republicans that if you contain slavery, that it would eventually die out. But that was the main reason for supporting the containment of slavery.
And the rise of this Republican Party that was hostile to slavery put tremendous pressure on the South, because the Southerners, like the Republicans, feared that an anti-slavery party would lead to slavery's destruction. And so this would play a huge role in creating tensions within the Democratic Party as a consequence prior to the election of 1860.
Right. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act brought Lincoln back into politics. Lincoln had been active in politics throughout the 1830s and 40s, but at the end of his one term as congressman in 1849, he returned to Springfield, and for the next 5 years, he more or less sat on the political sidelines, dabbling occasionally in local and national politics, but very little compared to what he had been doing from the year 1832 up to the year 1850. But in 1854, he comes off the political sidelines, roaring back into politics full time, and he becomes a leading champion of the anti-slavery movement in Illinois and helps to found the Republican Party, which officially gets underway in 1856. And so the Kansas-Nebraska Act had the same effect on large numbers of Northerners, and Lincoln was not unique in this regard, that the public believed largely that the Compromise of 1850, which Stephen A. Douglas had mentioned and gotten through, would take care of the slavery issue, that the divisiveness that had been generated by the slavery issue would disappear. So from 1850 to 1854, the public was more or less assured that the slavery issue would no longer roil American politics. But bam, in 1854, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, all of a sudden it comes roaring back. And so as Professor Peck suggested, Douglas did not anticipate fully the kind of backlash that his legislation would create. And one of the reasons it created such a revolutionary fervor, I use revolutionary somewhat loosely here, but the public was led to believe that over the years, slavery would gradually be whittled away at and would eventually disappear. That starting with the Constitution, which provided for Congress to regulate slavery in the territories and also to outlaw the slave trade if it saw fit. So steps were taken between 1789 and 1854, which slowly but surely and but fitfully led people to believe that slavery was on the way out, that the slave trade, the overseas slave trade, is abolished in 1807, 1808. Then slavery is kept out of the northern half of the Missouri Purchase territory, which was a huge chunk of land between the Mississippi and the Rockies. An enormous number of states were set aside for freedom. In 1787 and again in 89, the Northwest Territory was set aside for freedom. That is, the states that we now know as Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin were set aside for freedom. In 1850, with the Compromise of 1850, slave trading was abolished in Washington, D.C. So from the perspective of 1854, if you look back in American history, you could see some steps moving in the direction of the abolition of slavery. And then all of a sudden in 1854, you get a sudden sharp reversal of an early pattern of improvement, namely the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which set aside millions of acres for freedom in the West, was now abolished, and millions of acres that had been set aside for freedom were now thrown open to slavery. And it's that kind of situation which tends to produce revolutionary anger. When a period of improvement is followed by a sharp, sudden reversal of an earlier stage in that approval, that's when people really get angry. And Lincoln and many other people in the North did as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And that's the kind of psychological insight that Douglas lacked when he introduced that legislation.
All right. So you're setting the stage for us. And after 56, Republicans start to rethink on who they want to have as their candidate. And they spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the good balance would be to make sure that they win the vote in 1860. And so they start planning for the Republican convention. So Dr. Peck, I'm going to give the floor to Burlingame to give us a background on the Republican convention and leading to Lincoln's nomination. And then we'll bring you back in when it's time for the Democrats to have a turn.
Sounds good.
All right with you? All right.
Okay, and as you mentioned, the Republican Party in 1856, which was its first venture into presidential politics, the party had been founded in 1854 nationally, in Illinois in 1856. And so the first time they nominated a candidate to run for the presidency was 1856, and they choose John Charles Fremont, who is defeated in part because the Republicans had to compete not just with the Democrats for votes, but they had to compete with something called the American Party, which was a kind of amalgam of people who supported anti-Catholic and anti-immigration measures. It was a party that attracted a lot of old Whigs. The Whig Party had been the predecessor of the Republicans, and it died out in the early 1850s. So in 1856, then you have three parties running. You've got the Republicans, the Democrats, and the Americans. And the Republicans come amazingly close to winning, but they need to add to their base, they need to add the states of Indiana, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. Those were the key swing states. And if you could just persuade those states to vote Republican in 1860, then you stood a good chance of winning. So as the Republicans planned for the 1860 presidential nomination, they were thinking, now, okay, who's the most electable person we have among the leading candidates? And by far the most important candidate, the most heavily favored, was a senator from New York, William Henry Seward, who had been in the Senate, had been the governor of New York, had been in the Senate for a decade, was regarded as the intellectual and political head of the Republican Party. And if the Republican Party had been, a convention had been moved primarily by the emotion of gratitude, they would have nominated Seward. And it was widely believed that he would win the nomination. The odds-on candidate, favorite candidate, was Seward. There were other candidates, including, and Seward also had a reputation for being a radical on the slavery issue. He had, during the 1850 compromise debates, insisted that there was a higher law than the Constitution. That is one of the things that was incorporated into the 1850 compromise was something called the Fugitive Slave Act, which was pretty outrageous. It allowed Black people, in essence, to be kidnapped and taken off to the South to slavery. That any Black person could be accused of being a runaway slave and wouldn't get anything like a fair trial, and could, in effect, be kidnapped. And so Seward just said that law was certainly a violation of the higher law, even if it wasn't a violation of the Constitution. So that made him seem something of a radical in the eyes of many people in the North. And then in 1858, Seward, during the off-year election of that period, Seward said that there is an irrepressible conflict between the North and the South, which people interpreted wrongly to mean that he was calling for a war between the North and the South. In fact, all he was doing was saying that there was a conflict of policy issues that was irreconcilable, and it would eventually be having to be decided by a peaceful means. But people, particularly in the South, interpreted it as a call for a sectional war. So Seward was somewhat tainted by his reputation as a radical on the slavery issue. Another radical on the slavery issue was the governor, and then the governor of Ohio had been senator from Ohio, Salmon P. Chase. And Chase had a very strong anti-slavery record, but again was regarded as too radical to be able to carry the swing states of Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Illinois. Then there was a more conservative candidate from Missouri, Edward Bates, but he was considered too conservative. And then there was Lincoln, who was something of a dark horse. But Lincoln's credentials as an anti-slavery spokesman had been solidified in 1858 in his campaign with Stephen A. Douglas. That Lincoln turned out to be a particularly eloquent exponent of Republican doctrine and an effective debater against Douglas. Douglas was famed as the most effective debater in the country, but Lincoln fought him at least to a standstill in 1858. And thanks to the 1858 debates, and thanks to Douglas's prominence in 1858, the national spotlight shone on his election campaign against Lincoln. And so Lincoln wasn't famous, but he became famous thanks to the accident that he happened to live in Illinois and was challenging a person who was more prominent politically, really, than anybody else in the country, including the president. So Lincoln then achieved a reputation as somebody very solid on his for anti-slavery credentials. He was also thought to be more electable than any of the other candidates I've just mentioned, in part because while he did have strong anti-slavery credentials, he didn't have the baggage that Seward had. He wasn't perceived as being as radical on slavery as Seward was, although in fact he truly was. And he wasn't perceived as someone who was tainted by corruption. And one of the things I found in my research was that the corruption issue was more important than most people have acknowledged. That one of the reasons that Seward was not nominated was because the Republicans hoped to win all the votes that the Fremont candidacy won in 1856, plus some of those American Party supporters, that is the know-nothings, the anti-Catholic, anti-foreigner vote, in 1860. And one of the main ways to attract that vote was to have a candidate that emphasized how corrupt the Democrats were. And that corruption was oftentimes associated with immigration, that particularly the Irish vote in cities was regarded as manipulable. And so Seward was regarded as, if we nominated Seward, we couldn't emphasize the corruption issue, the Republicans felt. Whereas Lincoln was clean as a whistle. And Lincoln's reputation as honest old Abe was one of the things that made it possible for him to win the nomination. Another thing that helped him was the fact that it was held in Chicago, obviously in Illinois, and that the chairman of the Republican National Committee, who arranged for seating, had delegates arranged so that Lincoln's chances would be enhanced. On top of that, Lincoln won the nomination in 1860, in part because his very clever campaign managers made some bargains. That is, they had to get the Indiana vote and the Pennsylvania vote. If those two states voted for Lincoln as a nominee, then he would probably win the nomination. Now, how could you persuade them to vote for Lincoln rather than Seward? Well, A, he seemed more electable because he was less radical and less tainted by corruption. And B, because his managers, despite his orders, went and said to the delegates from Pennsylvania and from Indiana, look, if you throw your weight to us and support Lincoln for president, we will make sure that your honcho, your leading Republican, gets a cabinet post. Lincoln had specifically warned his advisors, don't make any promises in my name. And they said, Lincoln ain't here. He doesn't know what we're up against. And they went ahead and made those promises. So all those things helped combine to make Lincoln something of a surprise winner as the strongest candidate, the most electable candidate with the strongest anti-slavery credentials. So that's it in a nutshell.
All right, thank you, Lincoln. And as a reminder for those of you who've just joined us again, if you have any questions, feel free to add them in the comments and we'll get to them at the end of the program. So to give a great hurrah to Lincoln becoming the Republican nominee, we have Chris standing by, who's going to lead us off in an interesting song, and he's also going to provide some information on how the Republicans came up with some of these interesting campaign songs that you may have heard of before, but if not, Chris will introduce you to them.
Oh, well, thank you so much. What a pleasure it is to be here. So music is becoming an important political tool in Abraham Lincoln's era, and he capitalizes on this very significantly. 3 of the 4 songs I'll play today are pro-Lincoln, and they come from one publication called the Republican Songster. Now, this was a book that was compiled by Jesse Hutchinson of the Hutchinson Family Singers of over 50 songs that they had written for Lincoln's campaign. As Lincoln would later say, first of all, they were ardent abolitionists and took their message in concert across the country and performed for many of Lincoln's political events. He would later say that the crowds came out to see the Hutchinsons, but then they stuck around to see what the tall, lanky fellow might have to say. Now, they used a very common technique to write these political songs. They would take a melody everyone already knew and simply add new words. So what I'm going to do for you right now to kick this off is a song from the Republican Songster called Hurrah for Lincoln, and it's set to the melody of the old folk song, The Boatman's Dance. Hurrah, hurrah, have you heard the news? The Democrats have got the blues. They're puzzled now and all afraid because we've nominated Abe. Then shout, Freeman, shout, shout, Freeman, shout. We'll all unite and we'll bravely fight to the star of freedom's dawning. Hi-ho, we'll put them through, split their rails and haul them to. Hi-ho, we'll put them through, split their rails and haul them to. In all their ranks they cannot find a candidate to suit their mind. They kick and squirm, but it's no use. The game is up, their platform's loose. Then shout, Freeman, shout, shout, Freeman, shout. We'll all unite and we'll bravely fight to the star of freedom's dawning. Hi-ho, we'll put them through, split their rails and haul them to. Hi-ho, we'll put them through, split their rails and haul them to. They know that they will lose the day if they take up with Stephen A. And so to add to their humbug swell, I think they'd better take up Bell. Then shout, Freeman, shout, shout, Freeman, shout. We'll all unite and we'll bravely fight to the star of freedom's dawning. Hi-ho, we'll put them through, split their rails and haul them to. Hi-ho, we'll put them through, split their rails and haul them through. I hear they've bought an old steam tug on which to place poor little Doug for president. Too late they found his coattails come too near the ground. Then shout, Freeman, shout, shout, Freeman, shout. We'll all unite and we'll bravely fight to the star of freedom's dawning. Hi-ho, we'll put them through, split their rails and haul them to. Hi-ho, we'll put them through, split their rails and haul them to. Hurrah, hurrah, we're sure to win, and the way we'll beat will be a sin. The coming year's impending blast will show them they have crowed their last. Then shout, Freeman, Freeman, shout, shout, Freeman, shout. We'll all unite and we'll bravely fight to the star of freedom's dawning. Hi-ho, we'll put them through, split their rails and haul them to. Hi-ho, we'll put them through, split their rails and haul them through. There you go.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Now we're going to learn a little bit more about the Democratic Convention and find out the unique event that ended up happening that led to the split in the Democratic Party and the rise of Douglas. So I am going to add Dr. Peck, and he's going to let us know more about the historic Democratic Convention that took place.
All right, thanks, Ann. So the Democratic Party was in an interesting situation by 1860 because the Republicans had done so well in 1856. And as Professor Burlingame mentioned, we're trying to figure out how to nail down the last few northern states to win the election without any southern electoral votes. The Democratic Party needed to do extremely well in order to maintain its position as the party that produced the president. And yet, even though they were under tremendous pressure in that regard, they were not unified. Instead, they were becoming increasingly disunified during the late 1850s. And the central issue that they faced was property rights in slaves. That was the issue that was dividing them. Now, that issue had been dividing the country ever since the Constitutional Convention, and it had been increasingly relevant as decade after decade passed. And it had become especially relevant since the Mexican Cession, which is one of the reasons the Compromise of 1850 was necessary. But the tension torqued up even further with the Dred Scott decision in 1857, because the Chief Justice of the United States, Roger Taney, ruled that Congress couldn't prohibit slavery in the territories, which was a direct attempt to destroy the Republican Party, which, as Professor Burlingame mentioned, was attempting to attack slavery by preventing its expansion. But Taney didn't stop there. He also said that territorial legislatures, as creatures of Congress, could not themselves exclude slavery either. So neither Congress nor territorial legislatures could exclude slavery. So property rights in slaves had to be protected effectively, according to the Supreme Court, in the territories. Once this decision came out, it put Douglas and Northern Democrats in a terribly tight spot, because Douglas didn't believe that Northern Democrats would accept this doctrine, that they had to be able to exclude slavery by their vote. Otherwise, this was a gross abuse of the idea of democracy and, in a sense, of the whole idea of popular sovereignty, that the settlers would go out there and in good faith could choose whether or not slavery should be legalized. So Douglas, on the one hand, couldn't violate the wishes of his constituents. And on the other hand, though, he couldn't break up the party by just saying, I'm not going to support the Supreme Court's decision. So he created this very delicate space for himself that was enunciated most clearly during the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates in Freeport, Illinois. And it's become known as the Freeport Doctrine, even though he had articulated it earlier. And that doctrine was that, well, settlers can go into the territories, and if they don't support slavery, they simply won't pass laws protecting it. They won't actually prohibit it, so they'll abide by the Supreme Court decision, but they won't protect it. And this position of Douglas really angered Southern Democrats, because they said, this is terrible. You're really breaking with the Supreme Court while telling us that you support the Supreme Court. And that's outrageous, and we demand the real doctrine be recognized and carried out in the policies of this country, and certainly by our party. And so in 1859 and 1860, in Congress, Southerners demand what is called a territorial slave code or a congressional slave code in Congress, and Douglas refuses to give them this. He says, no, that he doesn't believe that property rights in slavery can be protected in that manner. He says that that's actually disadvantageous to Northerners, that Northerners and Southerners both had to abide by the property rights created in a territory or in a state. The property rights were different in different states, and the same was going to be true for territories, and that was the position of the Northern Democrats. So this one critical issue, property rights in slaves, is the issue that has to get adjudicated in the 1860 Democratic Convention, because that's the issue that over the last 3 years had been tearing the party apart. And the party meets in all places in Charleston, South Carolina, the source of all evils, it seems to Civil War historians. And that fact mattered because it was a highly secessionist, shall we say, atmosphere, because Southerners had been threatening secession for many years, and certainly in 1860 with the Republican platform saying that slavery was to be prohibited from the territories, and with the Republican nominee having committed himself to an ultimate extinction of slavery, in Lincoln's words. So the Southerners were saying these really remarkable things about the country's perpetuity. And of all places, of course, South Carolina is going to be saying these, articulating these doctrines most boldly. And hostility to Northern delegates was evident immediately. Correspondents of Douglas, who wasn't there, of course, wrote back to him saying that they're behaving recklessly, the Southerners. The ultras, as they were called, are saying all sorts of offensive things. And of course, prior to their arrival, the Alabama delegation came with express provisions that they were to leave the convention if a slave code provision was not adopted. And other Southern delegations came with a slave code provision that was their goal. That was what they were supposed to adopt, although they weren't committed to actually leaving if the party itself did not adopt that particular clause. So what ends up happening is that the Northern delegates will not bow down to Southern pressure. They decide to stand up like men, and that's literally how they talked about it in the convention, how they wrote about it to Douglas and to each other. They said, "We are tired of truckling, of putting our mouths in the dust, and we refuse to do it." And so they pushed through a popular sovereignty platform with their greater number of Northern Democratic votes. And when that happened, the Southerners, the lower South Southerners, walk out. The delegations in a din of deafening oratory and applause, with these South Carolinians, in the hall applauding crazily. They all walk out, and this is shocking to everyone who's thinking about the broader consequence for the nation, because if the Democratic Party is divided, how are the Republicans possibly going to be stopped? And if they're not stopped, will the Southerners then secede as they're threatening to? So the Democrats had a big problem. They tried to nominate Douglas in sort of the rump convention that existed, but they couldn't, because the Democratic Party had a 2/3 rule that the nominee had to get 2/3 of the vote. And Douglas didn't have 2/3 of the remaining vote. And so he couldn't get to the full number of delegates needed. And so the convention breaks up on May 3rd. It started in April, and it reconvenes in June in Baltimore with the same terrible consequence. The Southern delegations show up again, some of them to observe. One delegation didn't show up, but most of them arrive. However, there are competing delegations from the lower South states that were pledged essentially to support Douglas. And the credentialing committee, their big task was to decide which delegations to sit. And although the Northerners attempted to compromise, Douglas wanted a compromise, the credentialing committee refused to seat the Alabama delegation, this terrible delegation who'd blown up the first convention. And with that, not only do the lower South states leave again, but most all of the border South states go with them. And they go to a nearby hall and they select their own platform with a slave code provision, and they select Kentucky, the current Vice President John Breckinridge to be their presidential nominee, leaving the Northerners with a few Southerners to nominate Stephen A. Douglas, a man who'd been wanting the presidency for a long time, but never wanted it under these circumstances. They leave him with the Northern Democratic Party on a popular sovereignty platform. And that is how the Democratic Party and how Douglas moves into this unique election with the Democratic Party split, one half of it in the South under Breckinridge and one half of it in the North under Douglas.
Thank you, Dr. Peck, for giving us a better example of the Democratic Party and its preparation for the 1860 election, and the struggles that both the Republicans and the Democrats went through during this time, trying to sort out the issues that the country was grappling with. Earlier, we heard a campaign song for the Lincoln Republicans, and now we are moving on to a new song that was created for the Douglas campaign. And here is Chris giving us a first listen to the Douglas and Johnson campaign song. Take it away, Chris.
All righty. Well, thank you so much. Let me start by giving a shout out and thank you to Christian McWhirter, the musicologist from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, who was able to locate this song, the only Douglas campaign song that they found in their collection. He sent me the original sheet music, which you can see on the screen right now, and I was able to realize and track down the fact that it's sung to the melody of an old minstrel song, Dandy Jim of Caroline. I found that original song and built this arrangement, which I'll play for you, based on those traditional versions. I'm using an 1890 skinhead banjo, which is almost certainly the instrument that would have been instrument of choice in Lincoln's era. This might have been accompanied with a set of bones, a very rhythmic clacking sound, or perhaps a fiddle. The guitar would not become popular in terms of general population until quite a bit later. But this is the Douglas and Johnson campaign song. We'll raise our glorious banner high, Douglas and Johnson live or die. We'll vindicate our glorious cause, the Constitution and its laws. Aristocrats we do despise, for they the poor would disfranchise. The Constitution is our plan that gives to all the rights of man. With sordid gold their votes are bought, and by it silly fools are caught. But Democrats of olden times could not be caught with golden dimes, nor can they at present day, though many traps their foes may lay. The Constitution is our plan that gives to all rights of man. Then rally to the standard all, Douglas and Johnson in the fall. The ballot box November next, whatever be our foe's pretext. In rank and file we will rout, and the glorious victory shout. The Constitution is our plan that gives to all the rights of man.
Thank you, Chris. That was
Pleasure.
a first listen. I was so looking forward to that song because it is one I have not heard. And so I hope you'll have more opportunities to perform it.
I do too. It is just truly magical to find an old lost song like that and bring it back to life. So thanks for the opportunity.
All right. So next, so now that we have heard about the Republican convention, and the Democratic conventions, and a little bit about what their party was going through to prepare for the 1860 election, we come to the heart of the matter, which is what was the relationship between Lincoln and Douglas, both political and personal, and how did that affect the race of 1860? So I'm going to bring Dr. Burlingame and Dr. Peck up, and we are going to let them explain to us a little bit about the relationship between Lincoln and Douglas during this time and how it affected the campaign.
One by modern lights because Lincoln didn't go around the country urging people to vote for him and his party. And that was in keeping with the practice that had been established in previous decades. So the campaign, just viewed from Lincoln's point of view, if you just look at what Lincoln was doing, it was a stay-at-home campaign. Douglas, on the other hand, broke the mold and decided to campaign around the country. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Peck.
So it's an interesting question, Anne, because I personally have never been certain what the relations were like between Lincoln and Douglas, and you can read and hear different attitudes on this subject. Some people believe they were friends. Others believe they were pretty hostile to each other under the surface. I think there was a great deal of tension, has always been my take, because it's pretty clear that Lincoln criticized Douglas privately as well as publicly, and actually Professor Burlingame's research has uncovered some of this private criticism. But the public criticism has been known forever, and some of it was extremely fierce. Lincoln claims that Douglas is one of the greatest threats to American freedom, even in some respects more than the Southern slave owners, because Lincoln claims that Douglas's don't care policy for popular sovereignty, that I don't care whether or not territorial settlers vote for or against slavery, which he said many times. Lincoln said that don't care philosophy is going to lead everyone else not to care. And if people in the North don't care, well, we know people in the South do, and they'll vote for slavery, where we will get the perpetuation of slavery with that attitude. Therefore, he says, Douglas's attitudes are a tremendous danger to the destruction of the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and to the practice of freedom in America and around the world. These were harsh criticisms, and Douglas did not like them. He repudiated them and passionately, because it wasn't just Lincoln who said things like this. Other Republicans, of course, articulated similar doctrines, and certainly abolitionists disliked Douglas's doctrines profoundly. So all of that suggests to me that there was tension. But I also think that there was probably quite a bit of professional respect. They had emerged together in their 20s in Springfield, in the state legislature. They both had immense talent. I'm certain they recognized each other's talent. They socialized together. They both sort of courted Mary Todd Lincoln. Springfield's a small place, and they, they're both on the legal circuit, Lincoln more than Douglas, but they're lawyers, they're politicians, they're making their way in the world, they come from the same place. So I think there was a base level of respect as well, even though probably Lincoln had sort of an inferiority complex because Douglas had always been so successful, and we know Lincoln complains about that at one point in his career, writes a poignant little note about how Douglas has been so much more successful than him. And Douglas probably was a little bit patronizing, given that he became a statesman of great repute with even worldwide renown and had left Lincoln in Springfield. So I think there was an interesting dynamic. I'd be very curious to know what Michael thinks about it.
Okay, Graham. Well, one of the things that Lincoln says, allegedly during the course of the 1858 debates, that he was getting tired of Douglas's patronizing attitude toward him and treating him as a nobody. And Lincoln himself, as you say, was keenly aware that Douglas had achieved a kind of renown that Lincoln was nowhere near achieving. Lincoln's sum total of experience on the national level by 1860 was 1 2-year term in the House of Representatives in the late 1840s, whereas Douglas had been a member of the House of Representatives, and then he'd been senator, and in those days, senators were more important than presidents oftentimes. Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, people like that are remembered, and Franklin Pierce and Millard Fillmore and the like are not. And so Douglas was really famous and prominent, and he treated Lincoln as though he were just the opposite, which in some cases, to some extent, is true. But Lincoln really resented that kind of patronizing attitude, that sort of edge of contempt that Douglas had for him as a nobody. And so Lincoln allegedly says to one person, "If Douglas doesn't stop patronizing me, I'm going to get up and say, well, at least I don't have to have my wife accompany me to keep me sober." And Douglas, I found a lot of evidence to this effect that Douglas was oftentimes drunk during the campaign in 1858, and that Douglas does die much too early. And unfortunately for Lincoln, Lincoln could have used him as a rallier of patriotism during the Civil War, unlike some of the Democrats who tried to fill Douglas's shoes and didn't do it very well. But in any event, Douglas did drink too much, was, according to some of the sources I've seen, drunk during the 58 campaign on more than one occasion, and does die early, partly because of too much smoking and too much drinking. And apropos of why he thought Douglas was so dangerous, it wasn't his personality so much, but the project that Douglas was involved in. From Lincoln's point of view, as you were saying, Graham, Lincoln interpreted Douglas's project as one to convince the public that Black people were really not men in the eyes of the framers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And that Lincoln, this is one of the main differences between them. Lincoln said that when the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, that they meant Blacks as well. And Blacks were entitled to life, liberty, hello, liberty, so goodbye slavery, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, that doesn't mean that they should have voting rights and rights to serve on juries and that sort of thing, but they certainly deserve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Douglas denied that. He said, no. The Declaration of Independence was designed to protect white people of European background, and not Blacks or Fiji Islanders or Chinese coolies or any of those inferior races, Mexicans and the like. And so really what the campaign of 1858 and to some extent in 1860 represented was a contest between a party and a candidate who believed that all men are created equal, Lincoln, and a candidate who didn't believe that all men are created equal, Douglas. So it really was a very momentous campaign, both in 58 and 1860. And then the larger point is that if Lincoln was arguing, look, if the public is convinced that you shouldn't care about the morality of slavery, that's immaterial, and Douglas convinces the public of that to adopt that attitude, and then he wins the election, that will then make it possible for the Supreme Court, which is sensitive to political currents, despite pretensions to the contrary, that the Supreme Court is subject to and influenced by public opinion. And if the public has come to believe that slavery, the right or wrong of slavery is immaterial, then the Supreme Court will take a step further than it did in the Dred Scott decision. Now, as Graham pointed out, the Dred Scott decision said that Congress cannot prohibit slavery from going into the territories, and by extension, territorial legislatures cannot prohibit slavery from going into the territories. Now, why was that? Property rights. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution says that you cannot be that everybody's guaranteed life, liberty, and property, and that they cannot be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That is, you can't be jailed, you can't be fined, and you can't be executed unless you've had a fair trial. And so the Southerners said, look, we've got this property called slaves, and we want to take them into territories. And if you tell us we can't, you're denying us the use. You're not taking our property away, but you're denying us the use of that property anyway, which is tantamount to the same thing. And Lincoln was saying, look, that Fifth Amendment is going to get interpreted by the court to say no state can prohibit slavery from coming into its boundaries. And so all the northern states will all of a sudden become slave states if a new Dred Scott decision is handed down. And a new Dred Scott decision will be handed down prohibiting states to abolish slavery and forbid slavery to coming into their midst. But they'll do that if Douglas manages to persuade public opinion not to care about whether slavery is right or wrong. So that was the in Lincoln's view, the stakes that were involved, that the nation was going to become either all free or all slave, as he said in his famous House Divided speech at the beginning of the 58 campaign. And the danger that Douglas presented in Lincoln's mind was this anesthetizing effect that Douglas might have on public opinion to convince people that they shouldn't care about the morality of slavery, whether it was right or wrong. And that would then pave the way for this second Dred Scott decision, which would turn the United States into a slave nation entirely, not just partially.
All right. So in learning more about the relationship between Lincoln and Douglas, it leads us to our next big session, which is discussing the roles that their relationship played within their campaign. And so we're going to have Dr. Burlingame go first to talk about Lincoln's campaign and who made up his campaign committees and people who supported him, and also his supporters. Did they have any special nicknames, or what role did they play? Considering Lincoln kind of took a back seat to the campaign that was swirling around him. So we're going to pass it off to Dr. Burlingame.
Yes, well, as I mentioned earlier, and as you mentioned, Ann, Lincoln didn't actively campaign around the country. He made one public appearance in Springfield, very brief. And when people asked him, well, where do you stand on the issues? He said, well, I have published a version of the debates that Douglas and I had in 1858. And please read those. The Republican Party has adopted a platform, a national platform. Please read those. I have given numerous speeches against slavery in the 1850s. Read those. And so he says, I stand by the platform. And then so the campaign was then carried on largely by the Republican National Campaign Committee, the various state campaign committees that were headed up by the chief honcho in each state. Money was then distributed particularly to the swing states of Indiana and Pennsylvania, because the upper north, that is the north of New England and transplanted New England of the upper Midwest, were pretty safe. So the concentration of speakers and money and campaign pamphlets and marches and wide awake campaigning and all that sort of thing was carried out primarily in the lower north, particularly with special emphasis on the key swing states of Indiana and Pennsylvania. Illinois was pretty clearly going to go for Lincoln because of his Illinois background. But Douglas, of course, from Illinois too, but he was having a problem with the fact that there was a Southern Democratic nominee, namely Breckinridge, John C. Breckinridge. So that's how the campaign was carried out. And Lincoln would give advice to leaders of the various state parties. And he was hands-on in some ways in making recommendations about how campaign should be conducted in this state and that state. But largely, those decisions were made by the Republican National Campaign Committee and by the various campaign committees. Now, when it came to emphasizing issues, one of the striking things that, as I was mentioning earlier, apropos of Seward's failure to win the nomination, is Lincoln's ability to persuade voters who may not care about slavery very much, one way or the other. But a lot of people in the North cared about corruption, as I was suggesting earlier. And this is one of the things that the campaign literature emphasized very heavily, and editorials written by Republican editors. Don't vote for the Democrats. They're a corrupt party. Look at James Buchanan, his administration, that is the president who was incumbent at that time, was riddled with corruption, stealing and absconding with funds and kickbacks and bribes and all kinds of corruption. And that his immediate predecessor, Franklin Pierce, also a Democrat, was guilty of coddling corruption. And we need to have a room to sweep clean Washington and get rid of corruption. So that's one thing that was emphasized. Another thing that was emphasized time and again, which I think is also underappreciated in this campaign, is the Republicans were arguing, look, the Democrats stand for cancel culture. They didn't call it that back then, but the pro-slavery forces had been canceling anti-slavery forces in the South and in the North for decades. The most famous example occurred in 1856, when a member of the United States Senate, a leading anti-slavery champion, Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, was beaten almost to death on the floor of the U.S. Senate by a Southern congressman, a guy named Preston Brooks, who had taken offense at a speech that Sumner had given in which one of his relatives was ridiculed. And so this guy, Preston Brooks, comes into the Senate when it's in recess. Charles Sumner sitting at his desk, franking copies of his speech in which this Preston Brooks' relative was mentioned. Preston Brooks comes up to the desk where Sumner is seated and says, "You have offended the honor of my family and I'm here to avenge it." And he takes this big cane, heavyweight cane, and starts beating Sumner over the head. And it keeps beating him and beating him and beating him. And meanwhile, senators around there say, "Whoa, wait a minute, what's going on?" And the Southerners say, no, don't intervene. That son of a bitch deserves it. And Sumner was beaten into insensibility and sidelined for 3 years with serious neurological damage. And so Preston Brooks then becomes a kind of symbol in the eyes of the North of everything the South's done for cancel culture. That is, they've forbidden people to have abolitionist speakers, to have abolitionist literature, to have any criticism of slavery by a public figure or a visiting lecturer or what have you. That the South had imposed the gag rule in Congress. That one of the freedoms that rights were guaranteed in the Bill of Rights is the right to petition our government for redress of grievances. And so anti-slavery people would inundate Congress with petitions calling for the abolition of slavery in Washington. And the Southerners said, well, we're not going to pay any attention to those. We'll have a gag rule and all those petitions will immediately be tabled and never paid attention to. Southerners then censored the mail. Any abolitionist mail, that wouldn't be delivered. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was considered an example of Southern high-handedness, even though it was Douglas's brainchild. That this is the South's idea, this is the pro-slavery idea of making a compact. That in 1820, you promised that the millions of acres would be set aside for freedom. And then in 1854, you say, forget it, we didn't really mean it. Slavery can go into those territories. Then once the Kansas-Nebraska Act is implemented, then elections are held for territorial legislature, territorial governor, and the like. And what happens? Missouri slaveholders come across the border into Kansas, and they stuff the ballot boxes and they shoot up free soil towns, and they disrupt the elections, and they make sure that their pro-slavery people get elected. Then the Dred Scott decision. That's the Southerners on the Supreme Court that dominate the Supreme Court, and that's their idea of fair jurisprudence. That you rule the act of Congress unconstitutional on the basis of very flimsy historical research. In fact, demonstrably inaccurate historical research, and very questionable constitutional logic. That's their idea of fair play. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which was part of the compromise package that Douglas got through, allowed, as I was suggesting earlier, basically saying that no black people shall ever have a jury trial, a counsel, a right to appeal, all those guarantees that make sure that people can't be jailed for things and executed for things they didn't do. And so that's the South's idea of fair play, the Fugitive Slave Act. And so all these things combined then made a lot of people go to the polls in 1860 and say, it's not that I care so much about Lincoln and slavery and all that sort of thing, but by God, I'm tired of these people engaged in this high-handed, arbitrary, bullying fashion. And I'm going to the polls and I'm voting against cancel culture, in effect. So that's one of the things that made the 1860 campaign, from the Republican point of view, effective. So that's it in a nutshell. And Lincoln and Douglas don't have much to do personally with one another during the campaign.
Thank you, Dr. Burlingame. And I'd like to add the Songster book that Chris has been pulling from to go with the Republican campaign and the supporters that followed Lincoln. Most of them were known as the Wide Awakes. And what's very interesting about the Wide Awakes is they ended up wearing capes and hats and had lanterns that they walked in parades with in a variety of different towns. And in Springfield, Illinois, there was a large one in August 8th of 1860, which was remembered by the Illinois Art Humanities Council a few years back. So thank you, Dr. Burlingame, for filling us in on the maneuvers of the Republican campaign for the election of 1860. And we're going to switch over to Chris, and he's going to sing another campaign song for the Lincoln groups. Then we'll move forward. Thank you.
Very much. This is a song, once again, from the Republican songster. This one is called The People's Nominee, and it's sung to the melody of a Stephen Foster song, widely known and loved at that time, Nellie Bly. Now, Anne mentioned the Wide Awakes, and there are some references in this song to the Wide Awakes. At the very end, they talk about we'll roll on the ball. And one of the things that the Wide Awakes did in their parades was that they had this gigantic ball. When it was reproduced in Springfield 2 years ago, I believe it was paper mache. I'm not sure what the original would be, but it was rolled down the road with the marchers. And that's the roll on the ball reference you will see here. I'll also mention that this song goes fairly deep into many of the political points which our scholars have been making through this program, as opposed to the first song I did, which really just kind of poked fun at Douglas. So this is The People's Nominee. Republicans with peerless might proudly lead the van. Strike for freedom, strike for right, old Abe's an honest man. He a noble president, the ship of state will guide, while o'er the nation's senators Hamlin shall provide. I, Lincoln, ho, Lincoln, an honest man for me. I'll sing for you, I'll shout for you, the people's nominee. Once we had a compromise, a check to slavery's wrong. Douglas crushed the golden prize to help himself along. Then the North, then the Southwest, we rose with giant power. Pierce succumbed to the South's behest, but Douglas had to cower. Hi, Douglas, sly Douglas, a senator would be. So he tried the squatter dodge and went for Kansas free. Democrats or office rats met to nominate. Fire eaters came all aflame to sever state from state. Their slave code and cavode caused the softs to quake. The little giant, now defiant, no slave code would take. Oh, alas, beef is scarce, to the north they go. See once more at Baltimore our united foe. But the people met in mass in the boundless West. Of freedom's sons, a noble class, some love Seward best. Chase, McLean, and Bates, I ween, are worthy of the call. Old Honest Abe's the people's choice, and we'll roll on the ball. Hi, Lincoln, ho, Lincoln, president shall be. One and all, roll on the ball, the people's nominee. Hi, Lincoln, slave, Lincoln, Devon shall be. We'll one and all vote on the fall for the people's nominee.
you, Chris.
Thank you.
All right, we'll move to the next section. Right now, we will be discussing the next campaign, which is Stephen Douglas's campaign group, and what did they do to try to gather individuals to vote for Stephen Douglas, and what was his campaign like, and who were his followers. And with that, we're going to be turning over to Dr. Peck.
Hi, Ann. So Douglas and the Democratic Party in the North had a real challenge in 1860 because the party had blown up. And there were many ramifications of the party blowing up. The most notable was that parties really were an agglomeration of state parties. So the National Party only came together every 4 years. And as a bunch of state delegations all kind of pushed for the election of the nominee who was selected at the presidential convention. So just from the start, Douglas had already lost all of these state Democrats. So he had to try and fashion Democratic supporters in the South, and that was very difficult to do. He also had a related problem. The finance committees of the parties had to raise money. Well, you just lost half of the country to raise money from. And then in the remainder of the country in the North, who's going to give you money when it looks like you're going to lose? That's not a very attractive idea for people who are donors. So Douglas does select a tremendously influential figure, August Belmont, from New York City, who was a financier and who becomes chairman of the Democratic Party. And he held that position for many years and actually helped fashion the modern kind of national political party. But he certainly struggled to raise money for Douglas in the campaign, and Douglas ended up going into tremendous debt. He'd already had been doing so in 1858 with the campaign against Lincoln, and he goes into far more debt into 1860, precisely because he makes an unusual decision in the face of all these challenges to the campaign. And given the dire circumstances, in his view, should Lincoln be elected, he was very fearful of secession. He decides, as Professor Burlingame mentioned earlier, to do something utterly unique. He chooses to actually campaign. So while Lincoln is sitting in Springfield, Douglas, for 4 to 5 months, traverses the entire country actively. And this was a real turnabout, because the idea was it was unseemly to go ask the people to put you into the highest office of the land. It should be that you were so distinguished that they just elevate you as if, you know, by your great charisma and achievements, you are a natural selection. But Douglas abandons the seemly approach and embraces the unseemly approach. He justifies the beginning of campaigning by the idea that he's going to see his mother in New England. And he's mocked for this because everyone understands in the North that he's actually going to begin campaigning. And he does go to see his mother, but he also begins campaigning, apologizing every time he's sort of caught in the middle of a political speech that he didn't mean to give, he says at the end of the speech. But in fact, he starts articulating his standard advocacy of popular sovereignty as the one doctrine that can save the Union. And this really is the central core of his campaign, is unionism, because he's trying to tell Northerners and Southerners that if you don't want to go into a civil war, I'm the candidate to vote for. And he's actually very sympathetic to the Bell campaign, which we haven't talked about much, but the Constitutional Union Party that gets created largely in the border states. It's a border states party. So the Upper South, it'll take a lot of electoral votes from the Upper South. And Douglas works with the Bell campaign because he sees the Bell campaign as also a Union campaign, as a campaign sympathetic to his own. But he's not at all sympathetic to the Breckinridge campaign and the Southern Democrats. And he actually has the courage to go into the South to campaign for the Union. And this has some extraordinary consequences that really are greatly to Douglas's credit, how he handles them. He's campaigning in Norfolk, Virginia. And he, while on the stand, is given a piece of paper, a question from the audience, and says, is the South justified in seceding if Abraham Lincoln is elected president of the United States, even before Lincoln makes any overt act to violate the Constitution? And without missing a beat, without obfuscating, without lying, Douglas just says, absolutely not. The election of any man constitutionally to the presidency of the United States is no justification for breaking up this union, right in the middle of the South. And then he's handed another slip of paper, and he says, well, if the paper says, if we do this, if we leave, should the South be essentially coerced back in the Union? What should be the job of the president? And Douglas says, again, without hesitation, he thunders back, the president of the United States is pledged under the Constitution to maintain the Union, to uphold the law. That's what he swears when he's inaugurated. And we must obey the president as long as he's not violating the Constitution. That is his constitutional duty. And this was astonishing doctrine. The Southerners were shocked because to hear this from the mouth of Douglas mattered tremendously, because it meant that if Lincoln was elected and they seceded, they were potentially faced with resistance on the part of the entire North, because Douglas was far and away the most powerful Northern Democrat. And he ends up getting 40% of the Northern vote. So he has tremendous political power in the North as the representative of his party. And as it turns out, he's going to wield that party in favor of union after secession. So Douglas does not back down from this. He repeats this position throughout the South when he's touring. And in fact, he says it again. He goes back for a second tour of the South in the late fall when it's clear Lincoln's going to be elected, when like the gubernatorial elections in places like Pennsylvania show that Lincoln's going to carry the critical states, the swing states. Everyone knows Lincoln's going to be elected. Douglas tours the South again in the face of incoming secession and says, don't do it. You must not do that. And he was threatened. He could have been assassinated. We see later this happens with hotheads when they kill Lincoln. He could have been assassinated. He stands up to the risks, and he goes to the South and he speaks for union. So this really was Douglas's greatest hour in the viewpoint of many historians.
Thank you, Dr. Peck. It's a side of Douglas that we don't normally get to see. A lot of times we view Douglas during the 1858 debates, and we forget that during the presidential election, he makes so many moves that showcases him in a different light. And it shows that he was really fighting for the Union, even though his views may be a little different than Lincoln's. Which leads us to our next phase of the program, which is in the state of Illinois. We were divided between our two Illinois men, and specifically in Sangamon County. Sangamon County ended up voting for Douglas. Sangamon County was a Douglas county, whereas if you look at other counties such as Logan, that was a strong Lincoln County. And it's interesting to look at voting today, because in Illinois, the North tends to vote more towards the Democratic Party, and the South tends to vote more Republican. But in 1860, it was flip-flopped. So the northern part of Illinois voted for Lincoln, the Republican Party, and the Southern voted mostly for Breckinridge, Bell, and you had some Douglas supporters mixed in there. So to talk a little bit more about this divided state during the 1860s, which we got for our title for this program, I'm going to invite Dr. Burlingame and Dr. Peck to enlighten us a little bit on the division that Illinoisans had for the 1860 election.
Well, Graham is the Illinois historian in our department, so I turn it over to him.
So thank you, Michael. Illinois, in a sense, reflected the divisions of the country because it had been settled in the early 19th century initially by Southerners, and their descendants had proliferated, and there had been additional migrants into Southern Illinois from Southern states. And those states had always been intensely Democratic throughout Illinois' antebellum history, and they had always been strong supporters of the Democratic Party, and that did not change in 1860. That was the bedrock of Douglas's support. Yet at the same time, the northern half of the state, starting in the 1830s and then intensively growing stronger in the 1840s and the 1850s, had become an incredibly powerful stronghold of the Republican Party, and in fact, especially in Chicago, of outright abolitionist conviction. And the Republican Party's vote totals in Illinois were enormously padded by the huge majorities given by these anti-slavery types in the top half of the state. So the center of the state was where these two groups mixed, and that's why you had a division. So Springfield goes to Lincoln, which made him happy, even though Sangamon County barely went for Douglas, suggesting the division in the central part of the state. So yeah, there was division so extreme that one wag said there's not greater division between the North and the South than there is between Northern and Southern Illinois. The hostilities are equally severe within our state, and you can see why, because in truth, the whole country was on tenterhooks. Everyone was worried about the possible consequences of this election. And they had a right to worry, because a great civil war was going to claim many lives. And a lot of men expected to be fighting in that war. And a lot of women expected their loved menfolk to be lost in that war. So there was a reason for the anger and the concern. And in fact, there were predictions that Southern Illinois might try and secede from the state and join the Confederacy if there was secession. And as we know from the border states that were even more divided, as it turns out, than Illinois, there were a huge number of Kentuckians that did fight for the Confederacy and a huge number that fought for the Union. And so this sort of terrible division was reflected in Illinois in 1860, and understandably so.
And I might add that the same kind of pattern prevailed in neighboring states, Indiana, for example, and Ohio, that there really was at that period no such thing as a Midwestern state. That what you saw in Illinois and Indiana and Ohio was the North, in the northern part of the state, which was anti-slavery, and the South and the southern part of the state, pro-slavery. And dividing them was Route 40, the old national road. And that's because the people who settled north of the national road tended to be from New England and New York State and the like. And as Professor Peck was saying, that the people from the south of Route 40 tended to be from Kentucky and Virginia and Tennessee and other southern states. So within the boundaries of Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, you really had a kind of civil war brewing, at least politically. And then, as Professor Beck was suggesting, once the war breaks out, there was some real anxiety on the part of the Lincoln administration that Midwesterners who were dependent upon the river system of the Ohio River and the Mississippi to get their goods to market, at least before railroads became really important. But nonetheless, there's still that whole river traffic was important. And because of their Southern heritage, the people in Southern Illinois, Southern Ohio, and Southern Indiana might lead their states to cast their lot with the Confederacy ultimately. And the dissent against the war was particularly strong in Southern Illinois, Southern Indiana, and Southern Ohio for all those reasons.
All right, which leads us to the main portion of our program today, which is why even talk about Lincoln and this campaign and the rivalry. And in essence, for me, it feels like in studying Lincoln and Douglas, we can get a better understanding on how civil conversations were done, how tough topics were discussed between individuals who really wanted what was best for the country and had different ideas, but they were willing to listen to one another. And at the end of the day, their main goal was to unite the country and make democracy even more developed. So my final question for the two of you before we get to Chris's last song and the Q&A is what do you think were the defining traits after Lincoln was inaugurated? What do you think the relationship between the two of them and their relationship with the country was after Lincoln's inauguration?
Well, after at Lincoln's inauguration, there's a symbolic act. Lincoln comes out on the platform of the East Portico of the Capitol. He's set to give his rather lengthy first inaugural address, and he puts on his glasses and then looks for someplace to put his hat. And Douglas sees that he's somewhat awkward and volunteers to hold his hat. Now that story has been somewhat controversial, but we do have a contemporary witness testifying to that effect, as well as a lot of people who reminisce in their reminiscences talked about that event. In any event, that the holding Lincoln's hat during the first inaugural was a kind of symbolic gesture, which was then carried out by Douglas in the aftermath. As Graham was saying, one of the most statesmanlike things that Douglas ever did was in the 1860 campaign, particularly in the later stages of the campaign, to go to the South and say, don't secede, that would not be justified. Now, if Lincoln does behave unconstitutionally, I'll stand up and call him on it. But there's no justification for seceding from the Union because a man has been elected by constitutional means. That won't do. And so he demonstrated a lot of personal courage. I mean, to go to Louisiana and say things like that, whoa. So Lincoln was very grateful to Douglas for having taken that stand. But then during the period between the election and the inauguration, 4 months in those days, from early November to early March, Douglas worked very hard to come up with some kind of compromise that would allow the nation to keep together rather than split apart. And among other things, he supported measures which would allow slavery to go under the provisions of something called the Crittenden Compromise into areas that the Republican Party simply couldn't accept. What the Crittenden Compromise and Douglas and other compromise advocates were urging the Republicans to do was basically surrender. To say, okay, we campaigned on the platform plank, central plank was slavery shall not be allowed to expand, and now, okay, if you're going to break up the Union, we'll cave in and we'll accommodate you. Well, Lincoln said, no, can't do that. But then once the president is inaugurated, and Douglas meets with Lincoln and says he'll support him as long as he acts in a constitutional manner. And then when the war breaks out, he shows tremendous statesmanship and courage to go to Southern Illinois and to say there are only patriots and traitors now, rally around the administration. And one of the great tragedies from Lincoln's point of view is that Douglas dies in June of 1861 because he had enormous prestige and status with Northern Democrats. And he would have stood by the administration in order to preserve the Union much more staunchly than any of the successors who emerged on the national scene to take his place. And nobody really filled Douglas's shoes, but there were prominent Democrats who were much less supportive of Union and the administration than Douglas would have been. So Lincoln, and when Douglas dies, there's mourning in the White House, and he's honored. And Lincoln really deeply regretted losing somebody who had been a friendly rival, sometimes friendly, but a strong supporter in his hour of greatest need, which was once the war broke out.
Yeah, and I think, thanks, Michael, one of the reasons Lincoln was so sorry to see Douglas pass was because Douglas gives an extraordinary speech in late April after Fort Sumter. And he gives it at the Illinois State Capitol, now the old state capitol in Springfield. He had gone through the southern tier of the Ohio River Valley states that Michael had mentioned earlier to encourage Democrats there to respond to Fort Sumter appropriately, to defend the country, to act as patriots. And he ended up arriving in Springfield, of course, the origin of his great career in Springfield. And he had many political friends there, of course. And he was invited to address the Illinois state legislature. And he does so that evening. And of course, one of the great speakers of his era, he produces this astounding speech in the space of, a few hours, and he's meeting with people in between. You can find it online. It's a worthwhile speech to read. And there's many remarkable things in the speech. And among them are themes that Lincoln takes up during the war. Douglas says, if we lose this government, we are losing the chance to promote human freedom throughout the world. That is what is at stake. And it is beneath all of us to tread on that idea. We must stand up today to support that idea. And he tells Republicans and Democrats to sink partisanship into patriotism. He speaks to the Republicans and says, don't put us under your thumb in this moment. You've just defeated us. That's a hard thing for us to bear. And we're now going to be pitched into a war that we didn't want because we predicted this would happen. But the Southerners have attacked this government and they're trying to destroy it. And they're attacking the whole idea of representative government. Therefore, we will ally with you. So don't put us under your thumb. Treat us as your allies, which we wish to be. And then he turns to the Democrats in the state legislature and says, I know it's hard to lose. It's really tough to lose and then watch the people who beat us produce this calamity indirectly. They didn't directly produce it, but indirectly we know that their doctrines produced this, and we don't like their doctrines. And we will fight those doctrines if they try and continue to push them. We will fight abolition, he basically says. But all that considered, sink your sorrows into your patriotism. You must stand for the Union now, at all events. Our freedom as Americans, not just as Democrats, is resting on the result. And it's an astonishing speech. I don't do it justice. I should have memorized part of it for this presentation and provided it for the audience. But it's probably his greatest single moment. And obviously then, since he dies, it prevents him from doing things like perhaps opposing the Emancipation Proclamation, which have reduced the luster that he can deserve a claim for during this moment in April. But it certainly was a kind of speech, and the state legislature responded just with, avalanches of applause after every sentence, because they agreed that this was the position that the Union needed to take. And of course, it's important because Democrats pour out to support the Union. They pour into regiments to come and fight for the Union, and that would carry the Union through for the first year before you start getting a lot of partisanship. So it's in a sense a very positive ending to the career of a man who we look back on with rather mixed feelings now.
And could I underscore the point that you make, Graham, about what the larger stakes of the war were? Now, there's a natural tendency to think of the Civil War as being about two things, about slavery and about union. But on top of that, there was the issue of vindicate democracy. And Lincoln, 3 weeks after the outbreak of the war, is told by one of his personal secretaries, Mr. President, the mailbag is bulging with appeals for you to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln says to his secretary, well, that's an important issue to be sure, but I consider the central issue of this war to be, is popular government an absurdity or not? If we lose this war, it will go very far to discredit the idea of democracy throughout the war. And by extension, if we win this war, we'll go a great deal to vindicate the idea of democracy. So in Lincoln's view, the most significant aspect of the war was vindicating the of democracy, that common ordinary people could have a strong voice in their governance, and the nation that had that system would flourish and prosper.
Thank you, gentlemen. I know that we will have a number of questions at the end of the program, but we have one more song left from Chris, and it's one of the most popular songs that is sung in regards to Abraham Lincoln's campaign in 1860. So I'm going to end us with Chris and Lincoln and Liberty.
Thank you very much. Yes, as Ann mentioned, this proves to be one of the most popular songs from the Republican songster. As a matter of fact, Lincoln will later claim that this song helped him win the presidency. True to form, they use the melody of a long-known Irish folk song, Rosin the Bow, which ironically enough had already been used as the melody for a campaign song for Henry Clay a number of years earlier. And they come up with this song that became a very important song during the Civil War as well, Lincoln and Liberty. Hurrah for the choice of the nation, our chieftain so brave and so true. We'll go for the great Reformation, for Lincoln and liberty too. We'll go for the son of Kentucky, the hero of usuredom through. The pride of the suckers so lucky, for Lincoln and liberty too. Our good David's sling is unerring, the slavocrat's giant he slew. Then shout for the freedom preferring, for Lincoln and liberty too. They'll know what by felling and mauling our railmaker statesmen can do. For the people are everywhere calling, for Lincoln and liberty too. Then up with the banner so glorious, the star-spangled red, white, and blue. We'll fight till the cause is victorious, for Lincoln and liberty too. Then up with the banner so glorious, the star-spangled red, white, and blue. We'll fight till the cause is victorious, for Lincoln and liberty too.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to bring all of our performer and our historians back. I want to thank everybody for joining us today during this program. And I'm going to open it up to questions. I know that we've had a few during the program that have been listed. So I'm going to go through our listing of questions and bring them up. Gentlemen, it'll be at the bottom of the screen, but I will also read them out for you. So we have our first one here. This person is a scholar from Virginia. It's quite large, so sorry if we call it cover up. But he is tuning in from Charlottesville, Virginia, and he is hoping that we could offer some insight into the internal divisions within the Illinois Republican Party. Specifically the rivalry between John Wentworth and Norman Judd. Some historians, such as Russell McClintock, have characterized this division as ideological in nature. But his research says something a little bit different. So Burlingame and Peck, could you highlight a little bit more on the divisions within the Illinois Republican Party?
Well, I'm inclined to agree with our colleague in Charlottesville that the divisions between Norman B. Judd and Long John Wentworth were largely a matter of personality rather than ideology. I've not done a great deal of research into this, but I do know that Lincoln was very eager to keep those two guys from going to war with each other and splitting the Republican Party. But insofar as I'm aware of the essence of the differences between them, that it was more a matter of personality than ideology.
Yeah, I think Don Fehrenbacher wrote an article about that years ago, if I recall. I think I read it a few decades ago, and he certainly treats it in his biography of John Wentworth. So you've probably read Fehrenbacher's piece already, but I'd certainly encourage you to go to that as a first source. But yeah, I mean, I'm not aware really of huge ideological divisions between the party. The typical divisions that are described are between the more radical abolitionist element and the so-called more moderate conservative element. That's got a lot of attention over the years. But between those two people, I think that there's probably not a lot of reason to believe that.
Right, and they're both Chicagoans.
That has an interesting history, but that's a topic for another time, between those in central Illinois and those in northern Illinois. Our question comes from Germany. So Angela Mayer, she had a question earlier on in the program that stated, Mr. Burlingame, or Dr. Burlingame, you mentioned the promises the campaign managers made in Lincoln's absence. Did he know about it or not?
Überhaupt nicht. Hatte keine Ahnung daran. Also, no, he didn't know anything about that. He wrote and said, do not make any bargains in my name. I will not honor them. And as I think I mentioned earlier, David Davis, who was running the show, said, Lincoln ain't here. He doesn't know what we're up against. We got to get these Pennsylvania and Indiana delegates on our side, and they're asking for a cabinet post. So, so then the question arises: once Lincoln is elected, does he feel obliged to then honor those commitments? And it's one of the things that he finds most difficult in the early, throughout the secession winter, and then in the early. In the early days of his administration, or right up to the inauguration of what to do with Simon Cameron, and Lincoln was not eager to nominate Simon Cameron to a cabinet post, and Lincoln was in effect told by his campaign managers that look, we've made a deal with this guy, you got to honor it. And when a Pennsylvania congressman comes out to Springfield to lobby on behalf of Cameron, Lincoln says, how can I do something like nominating Cameron to a cabinet post just after I have been elected largely on my reputation as honest old aide? Now, how can I do that? How can I, after winning election on that basis, appoint a man like Cameron whose name stinks in the nostrils of the American public for corruption? But he does so anyway. He feels the political, if there had been a viable candidate, if the Pennsylvanians had been able to get behind another candidate, he might have chosen somebody else. And to a lesser extent, he had the same problem with Indiana, that a cabinet post had been promised to Indiana, not necessarily to a particular person, but since the leading Republican in Indiana was Caleb Blood Smith, and Smith had been a good campaigner in 1860. Lincoln did nominate him, and it turns out that those were the two worst cabinet choices he made.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Burlingame, because this is kind of a hearsay. But wasn't Cameron in charge? The reason why a lot of troops ended up getting deaf horses?
Well, the story about Cameron's ineptitude as Secretary of War or Legion, that I'm not particularly familiar with that story. But Lincoln did eventually let him go, not so much for corruption, but just for ineptitude.
All right, this question goes to Chris. So Chris, you presented campaign songs from both parties. From an artist view, which ones are the most interesting for a musician to learn about?
Very interesting question. I have found significantly more material from the Lincoln campaign than the Douglas campaign. That could be a factor of Lincoln taking advantage of music more than Douglas, although I've heard anecdotal stories where Douglas used music extensively as well, or it might be a function of the fact that the winner takes all. Lincoln won, and therefore his material has been preserved, whereas Douglas's perhaps has not. The challenge with working with this historical material, for me, comes down to reinterpreting it in a way that reflects its original style. I always try to at least emulate the original style it might have been performed in. But then the other issue, a lot of these are songs that they have created by using established melodies and then forcing lyrics onto them. The Douglas campaign song was incredibly difficult to sing. I had to actually do a passage where there are 4 lines. I've got to sing all 4 lines on a single breath. simply because it's a forced combination of melody and lyrics. In terms of which side is more engaging, I've heard arguments in the past how the North had more powerful songs and that this helped win the war. And they always use the example of Battle Hymn of the Republic versus Dixie, an old minstrel song. I can't speak to any authority about that, but I think only based on the limited Douglas information that I've found, the Lincoln songs tend to get a little deeper into things, and they are certainly pretty lively. There are a number of them that mock the opponents, such as the first one that we did today, where they take that they go a little over the line in terms of what we would consider appropriate today. But politics in those days was quite rough and tumble. So if I had to choose one, I would say I have worked more extensively with the Lincoln material, and there's a lot more of it, but that could merely be a function of what's available at this point.
Dr. Peck, have you found any Douglas campaign songs in your research?
I have not. I've done no research in music.
All right. Well, I hope that, Chris, you'll be able to find more Douglas songs and maybe a Bell and a Breckenridge in there.
I'll tell you what, it's very exciting to discover old material and bring it back to life. So I hope I get that opportunity down the road. Anyone who is listening in that has suggestions of other campaign songs, particularly of Douglas or Bell or Breckenridge, by all means, I would love to know about that.
And since we're on the topic, oh, sorry, Dr. Burlingame.
Well, let me just say that to underscore your point, Chris, I think both Graham and I would say that it really is fun to bring old things to light and bring them to life.
Yeah. You can connect it with a piece of music. It gives you a sense of the time and the place, right, which I think can really almost create a visceral connection to a historic moment.
So speaking of campaign materials, since we heard songs today, Dr. Peck and Dr. Burlingame, throughout your research, how do I phrase this? What was your most shocking or exciting or mind-blowing moment when you gone into the historic record and studying the campaigns of Lincoln and Douglas and possibly their counterparts? What was your favorite thing that you found out in studying these iconic individuals?
Well, that's an easy one for me to answer. I think it might be a tough one for Michael because he's found so many things, more than anyone else ever, I suspect. So he'll have to pick and choose from a vast array of possibilities. But I have only one thing that I found that was particularly notable. I found a fairly lengthy new version of Lincoln's Peoria speech, which he gave in Springfield at the Illinois State Fair in 1854, when he was rebuking Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act. And it hadn't been discovered before because it was in a Missouri paper, the Missouri Republican. And I distinctly remember finding it because I was actually just trying to collect Douglas speeches, and I was reading a book on Douglas, I forget which, and I noticed there was a citation to something he said in the Missouri Republican newspaper. So I simply ordered the newspaper, an interlibrary loan, and it came on a microfilm, and I was just scrolling to it to get to the date, and I'm reading through it, and well, the first thing was, well, this is weird. This is actually about the Illinois State Fair, and I should have probably figured it out more quickly had I been looking at the date, but I was more reading than thinking. But it slowly dawned on me. I was like, wait a minute, this is Lincoln, and then there's got bits of Douglas in here, and as a response, and I was like, whoa, this isn't a version of Lincoln's speech in 1854, my favorite Lincoln speech, actually. And I thought, I don't think this is in Bassler. I don't think this is in the collected works. So I got up from the desk in the library and I hightailed it to my office because I'd stolen the Bassler volumes. They weren't in the library. They lived in my office. And I looked through it and there was just this, my skin was tingling. I was like, can it be possible that I just found a new version of the Peoria address? It didn't seem possible. But sure enough, it wasn't in there. So that's my story. It's the only one I've got. Michael will be talking for hours if he doesn't just get one.
Well, thank you for your kind words, Graham. And The Peoria speech is one of my absolute favorite too. That if you're interested in reading one Lincoln speech that really gives you an idea of the core of his anti-slavery views, that's the speech to give. And it's the first speech he gives when he comes back from the political sidelines. He'd been sitting on the sidelines for 5 years. And he had never really spoken out dramatically against slavery. He'd voted against slavery as a congressman and all that, but he'd never given a really ringing anti-slavery speech. And this speech, which we know is the Peoria speech, but which version of which were given in Springfield and elsewhere, it's a real contribution to have an alternative version to the one that had wound up in the collected works. That's a real find. Anyway, the thing that I found most exciting when I was doing my research on Lincoln and Washington, I spent a lot of time at the Library of Congress, and I was going through the Frederick Douglass papers. And I stumbled across a folder that said Lincoln. So I opened it up and said, whoa, wait a minute. Here's the speech that he gives on June 1st, 1865, 6 weeks after Lincoln is murdered. And it's a eulogy to Lincoln. And it's given at Cooper Union, which was one of the most prominent places in the country to give a speech. And in this speech, Frederick Douglass says, Abraham Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president, the first to rise above the prejudice of his time and his country. By inviting me, Frederick Douglass, to come to the White House to consult on public affairs, he was saying, by that gesture, I am the president of the black people and the white people. I mean to honor their rights as men and citizens. I thought, holy mackerel. And I thought particularly that phrase, emphatically the black man's president, because when people talk about Lincoln and race, they oftentimes go to an 1876 speech, a very famous speech that Douglass gave, in which he said that Abraham Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president, and we black folk were only his stepchildren. And I thought, wait a minute, I don't understand this, because I had looked through the speeches that Frederick Douglass had given that had been collected in 5 volumes by the Yale and published by the Yale University Press and done by people at Yale. And I went to I said, my goodness, I read those volumes. I thought I would surely have noticed a speech with such a dramatic statement as emphatically the black man's president. And so I went to volume 3 and looked what, June 1st, not there. I couldn't believe it. So I wrote to the people at Yale and said, what's up? And no response. So I called and left a message, no response. Well, those of us who went to Princeton aren't surprised that Yale would behave in this fashion. But so that was really a very eye-opening moment. And so I'm writing a book now about Lincoln's interactions with black people, not his speeches and writings and all that sort of thing, but how he interacted with people in Springfield and Washington. And I'm calling it emphatically the black man's president, Abraham Lincoln and African Americans. So that was a really exciting experience to find that speech.
And that's exciting to hear the title of your book. I don't think I've heard you announce it yet.
Well, it's the title ultimately gets decided by the publisher. So and it's not a contract, but we haven't decided the definitive title. So
my favorite document has not been found yet.
What's that?
But I know that it exists because it was written in a Winchester newspaper. So you love the Peoria speech. Well, the half of that speech is the Winchester speech that was given. Right. And I'm actually from Winchester, Illinois, and my family still lives there. Our farm ground was there. And I believe that I have ancestors who were there at the time the speech was possibly given in Winchester. And so it's very important to me to learn as much as I can about it. And hopefully one of these days it will just magically appear, but I highly doubt it. But I will always hope for that. But I do know that the Peoria speech is a favorite among most. The real document that I love the most is when Lincoln is serving in Congress, and he writes back to Mary about the 2 boys. And he is talking about how much he misses them and misses her. And how he said that you seem to have bothered me when I was attending to business, but now with nothing but business. And of course, I'm paraphrasing him. But the fact that he was just like any other father, husband, he missed his family and he adored them. And so that to me, I really admire about Mr. Lincoln is how much he was a family man, even though he and his father didn't really get along. But he did know what kind of father he wanted to be. And that to me, I think is very sweet. So bringing kind of a little bit of a heart and soul to the great man. So our last question that I'll end on, which is very timely because we look at Lincoln's speeches for inspiration. And we look at the character of Lincoln to see what we want in a great leader. And one of our questions today brings to light one of Lincoln's shortest speeches. I think it is his shortest speech. So the Gettysburg Address, which was done in 2 minutes, and the other speaker, Edward Everett, who was also chosen to speak. Our question comes from Bill Shepard, and it states, could either speaker comment upon the irony of Edward Everett, the VP candidate of the Constitutional Union Party, being the primary speaker, not Lincoln, at Gettysburg on November 19, 1863? Whoever wants to go.
It is ironic that the Constitutional Union Party, which had nominated John Bell as their presidential candidate and did manage to win the upper South states, and that he would then be the principal speaker at Gettysburg, and Lincoln would be considered the not the main course, but the side dish. It is quite ironic, and it's also quite ironic that Edward Everett was the premier orator of that era, the man who was most highly regarded as an eloquent, articulate, forceful orator, would give a speech that is pretty dull, actually. I'm just reading it. It's like trying to wade through molasses. And Lincoln giving his little pithy 272-word remarks has created an immortal masterpiece. So the ironies are abundant in that juxtaposition.
Dr. Peck, any comments on that?
Only that I met a descendant of Edward Everett once, and he apologized to me for the speech. So,
well, I'm glad we were able to end on a lighter note and to comment on Edward Everett. Our talk has lasted as long as his speech, I think. Well, it's been very entertaining and enlightening to learn about the two great men and the people they represented at the time. And we did get another question. It's a bit controversial because it deals with the Douglas statue here in Illinois and Douglas's portrait. But I am going to tell people to look out for Graham's, Dr. Peck's article that he wrote and the press video that we have on our Facebook page about Dr. Peck's comments on the Douglas statue. And gentlemen, if you want to comment on it, I will open the floor to you. But if not, I will refer back to your documents.
Yeah, I think, Anne, if you've posted that on the page, then that's probably a good place to go read about it. Is that the piece I did with the TV station that's 30 minutes in duration?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, I think that's a good place to go if you're interested. I would say another thing that you can do on Amazon Prime, I posted about 3-4 months ago my first film, which is called Stephen A. Douglas and the Fate of American Democracy. And that film is available if you have Amazon for free right now. And it's about an hour in length, and it gives you a whole biography of Douglas's life. So it'll cover some of the episodes that we've covered right here, except that you'll also have a lot of visuals. It's a documentary in the Ken Burns style, and so that also will give you some information to think about the Douglas statue issue in light of his life.
And that's a terrific film. I urge everybody who's tuned in to go to Amazon and look at it. It's great.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today in the discussion on Illinois rivals, Lincoln and Douglas, and the 1860 election. Thank you, Chris, for providing historic insight to songs of the period and how people celebrated their candidate. Dr. Peck, Dr. Burlingame, thank you for providing the historic insights into the worlds of Lincoln and Douglas and the people who voted for the two candidates. And the important aspect of all of this is encouraging everyone to go out and vote. So next Tuesday, which is election day, make sure that you get out and vote for your candidate. So by the end, we will have our nation's choice for president of the United States. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. If you enjoyed this program, I encourage you to go out and check out our website, check out our social media pages. We will be having more videos like this. And very important, as Dr. Peck and Dr. Burlingame know, Lincoln's birthday next year is going to be a big one because the Center for Lincoln Studies will be opening its doors. Yay! And we will be open to the public physically, depending on the COVID situation. But if you have any questions or want to give to the Center for Lincoln Studies, feel free to follow the link that I will provide at the end of this video, as well as visiting us here at the center or even just giving us a call in. We love hearing from you. And if you have any Lincoln documents, I'm pretty sure we would all love to hear about it. And to quote Chris, if you find any campaign songs from the 1860s, send them his way. I'm sure we would all love to hear the songs of the campaign again. Chris also has a website, so I encourage you to visit Chris's website to follow him and see what other interesting avenues he goes down in regards to songs of the past and the stories that go with them. So thank you again, everyone, and come and see us again soon.
Thanks, Ann. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you,
Thank you, Michael.
And Chris.
Pleasure to work with you, gentlemen.
Thank you.